welcome to everyone who is having a cup of coffee with us this morning and a bit of a conversation virtually. Both Senator Donovan and I have done numerous virtual town halls now, and while we enjoy seeing everyone in person, this is certainly a second best option. A little bit about our agenda for this morning. Senator Donovan and I will take a couple of minutes to update you on our most recent legislative session, our successes, our challenges, what we were able to accomplish in our 3 or so weeks together, and then take your questions. I'm very grateful to those of you who logged in early and gave us some questions already. We've got those lined up in the queue. For our conversation today, if you would like to ask an additional question or if you didn't get a chance to add one before, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our staff will be monitoring that, as well as Facebook. We'll be streaming live on Facebook today. McCluskie for CO, McCluskie for Colorado. My representative page will have this live as well. So we welcome your input as we go along. And with that, Senator Donovan, do you want to kick us off this morning with a reflection on the session and your accomplishments?
Well, sure, and thank you so much. It's always really nice to do these with our overlapping House members when we can pull our Senate and House together. So I think many of you are from Pitkin, Lake, Chaffee, and Summit Counties, but I think we have some others who have joined us as well. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us with your cup of brew this morning, if you're a tea drinker, a coffee drinker, and finding an hour in your day to catch up with us a little bit. Like Rep. McCluskie said, we would much rather be doing these in person, but of course we're finding out new ways to connect even if we can't be together. What an interesting session for sure, and on a lot of different fronts, but obviously what looms large in everyone's conversations these days is the impact of COVID-19 on the session. When we arrived in January to start our work, I don't think any of us could have predicted that just halfway through the session, just months later from our first days, we would be having the really difficult conversation to suspend session temporarily. And we did that to make sure that everyone that works in the building and those people that visit the building, we put health and safety at the forefront of those conversations. So it was absolutely the right choice to suspend session. But what that also meant is we had a much shorter session this year because of the time that we temporarily adjourned, and then we only came back for 3 weeks to finish on. Knowing that we were going to have that abbreviated time back in the building, we really had to focus on what were going to be our priorities and what we needed to do back in the building, while knowing that one of our main focuses, of course, had to be respond to COVID-19. So, for the folks that are on this call and the counties that we kind of pulled together today, as well as the other mountain communities of Rep. McCluskie's and our shared districts, really felt COVID-19 more significant than almost anywhere in the state. And for some of the ski resort communities that were first and hardest hit, felt it more harshly than anywhere else in the country. And I think it's just important to continue to say that out loud for each other, because these really are what is become maybe an overused word, but it is still so true. These are unprecedented times. And so some of the work that I would like to highlight, and maybe so one of us doesn't, maybe I'll do some COVID-19 bills. I can jump back over to Rep. McCluskie and then I can come back to some other bills. But we passed a slate of bills to help address the immediate concerns of COVID-19, like a bill that talked about earned paid sick leave, and also what we need to do requiring people to adhere to the federal guidelines. We did some work around evictions. And then we did quite a bit of work around economic recovery, including a bill that I carried that I would encourage many of you to look into if you are a small business owner. It's Bill 1413. And sorry to give you that wonky thing to try to find on the web, but it actually is quite easy. If you just look up Colorado HB 1413, you should get there. And what's exciting about this bill is it'll be a somewhat of a continuation or replacement of, roughly think of the PPP program that the feds have. It's grants to small businesses for them to continue to be able to keep their doors open during these times. So we know that a lot of the federal resources will start to end in the coming months. I'm not supportive of that, but it seems like the politics in DC can't align to continue many of the really important federal programs that have been put in place over the past months. So we at the state are looking at what we need to do and where we can, knowing that we don't have quite the resources of the federal government. We can't print our own money in Colorado to continue to aid in the short-term economic recovery while keeping an eye on the long-term economic recovery. So let me kick it back over to Rep. McCluskie. Maybe she can talk a little bit more about the COVID-19 specific items, particularly because she will not sing her own praises. I will sing her praises as I kick it over to her. Her work on the Joint Budget Committee this session was some of the hardest and most difficult work I've ever seen a lawmaker have to undertake, of having to cut and address a $3.3 billion shortfall, which translated to about a 25% cut in the state's budget. That having to cut out a quarter of your budget resulted in some incredibly hard decisions, and no decision. When you run for office, this is not what you want to do, right? You don't want to figure out if you have to cut from education, from our corrections program, from our staffing departments. I mean, there's no good way to cut that much money, but I couldn't be more proud of the budget that the Joint Budget Committee and put together, and I did support it with a vote. But also with Rep. McCluskie being an incredible voice for the Western Slope, rural Colorado, and mountain communities, I'm always very confident that our communities aren't left out in the budgeting process. So, Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 stuff and the joyful budget that you had to put together under these circumstances?
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for the kind words. I do think it is terrific that we share the 4 counties that we do, and always so glad to be your partner as it would be in legislation and in working together at the state for the people and the communities we care so much about. As you said, we can't print money. Colorado's 1 or 2 constitutional requirements for the General Assembly are that we pass the long bill, the budget every year, a balanced budget, as well as the School Finance Act. And yes, it was tremendously difficult to have to make those cuts this year. For any of you that saw the Denver Post article this weekend, reporter Alex Burness put a really fine point on some of the real people impacts that happened because of our cuts to those individuals with developmental disabilities, to our family resource centers, to our K-12 and higher ed education programs. It was a tough article to read, and it reminds me that many of the cuts that we made, while we tried to protect essential services, while we saved higher education and public school cuts for the very end, everybody is going to feel this change in state funding for the 2020-21 fiscal year. Our fiscal year starts July 1st, as I think many of you know. And so this new budget comes into effect then. A few of the cuts that we did make, there was a 5% cut to personal services for all state departments. I know there were concerns about legislators continuing to get raises or seeing increases in their per diem. That did not happen. Legislator salaries were frozen as is, per diem rates were frozen, and then a 5% personal services reduction, which we hope can be achieved through attrition and other savings in benefits without having to do any layoffs, furloughs, or pay cuts. There was also a 1% across the board community provider rate cut, and that's for those individuals providing those healthcare services in communities. There had been potential for a much greater decrease there, cut there, but we were able to keep it at 1%. We froze all new capital construction. We had about 170 million teed up and ready to go. Several projects that were continuation projects. All of those dollars were frozen, so none of the new projects started, and unfortunately, some of our continuation projects will not be continued. And then we saw decreases to many of our grant programs that had just been initiated in the past couple of years, either grant programs that were defunded or just paused for a period of time. I know in Lake County, we have some grant programs through Lake County Build a Generation, as well as the county, and we were very pleased that we were able to keep those grant program funds in place so they could finish out this cycle, and hopefully with a rebounding economy, we see those grant programs continue into the future with additional funds. I appreciate as well Senator Donovan's highlight on some of the COVID-19 package bills that we put together with roughly $70 million that had come from federal stimulus funds. House Bill 1413, which Senator Donovan mentioned and championed, is a big one for our small businesses all over the state, and particularly pleased to see that the small business dollars are parsed out fairly so that rural Colorado will get their fair share. It's also important to note that the $1.7 billion that came in from the feds, about $1 billion of that went to public schools and higher education. And the dollars come with very strict guidance on how they may be used. So for our K-12 schools here in the high country and or for our universities and colleges, the dollars must be used to directly respond to COVID-19 impacts. So that might be remote learning, it might be specific needs for students that are living on campus at our colleges or universities, it might be for cleaning services or additional challenges that our facilities will now have in light of the pandemic. And while we are grateful for those federal funds and the ability to share those with our schools, the challenge now is how do we, without more flexibility or more federal funding, how do we not feel the impacts of some of the challenges we faced with our budget? We did take a $490 million reduction in higher ed, what translated to about a 58% reduction to their funding from the state. Again, they do have the federal funds for this next year, but only for this next year, and those funds are restricted. For K-12, there was about a $510 million amount from the federal funding, but we unfortunately had to take even more than that from our K-12 schools this next year because we had to increase the budget stabilization factor. Without going into a great detail there, just know that while I think we did a fairly good job in keeping everyone whole for this next year, there will be challenges beyond 2021 as we look into the future for the state of Colorado. Senator Donovan, maybe you want to highlight some of the other great legislation that you were able to pass.
Yeah, thanks. So while we did have an abbreviated session, we still were able to accomplish a lot that I'm really proud of, and a lot of it in a bipartisan manner, which I think sometimes is lost in the dialogue in the press. But we also had to make some hard decisions about what bills to pursue next year or to let go. Either because we knew that in the abbreviated time frame, there wouldn't be the sufficient space to get it done, or because as we were looking at the budget that Rep. McCluskie just described, there just wouldn't be the financial resources to implement the bill in the way that it needed to be. So an example of a bill that was really hard to step away from was the public option that I was working on. There was a broad coalition of us that work in the healthcare arena. Rep. McCluskie is a huge champion in that area, and one of my main partners in the House, along with Rep. Dylan Roberts. And so this public option had its first hearing in the House. It had gotten out of committee. We were having really good conversations, tough conversations with the hospitals. One hospital was nearing their support publicly of the bill as written. And Rep. Roberts and I just had a couple really hard phone calls where we said, you know, we really value stakeholder input and transparency in our bill process. And we knew that we needed our healthcare workers and our hospitals to be focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic. And we couldn't also ask them to focus on working on a public option at the same time. So we pulled the public option, but we will be working on it next session without a doubt, picking up where we left off and seeing how we can make sure the public option moves forward in Colorado. I think it's a really important next step in our healthcare solution because it creates competition and should create a lower cost option on the healthcare market that individuals can purchase. So it was tough to see public option get sidelined, but our work is not done there. Also had to put aside bills on conservation easements, but I know we'll work on that next year. That's a really important tool for rural mountain communities where the pressures of ski resorts can often, and kind of resort community real estate prices can really pressure local families that are trying to stay in the ag business. And it's a way that we can preserve the heritage of ag and open spaces in our communities. So I think conservation easements, we will return to that next session. We had gotten that bill to a really important place too. We just couldn't figure out the fiscal aspect of it, the financial aspect of it as well. So, and also one other bill that I'll highlight, because I think it was just really important work, but it will not come back next session in its form, was the work I did around wolves and them being either reintroduced in Colorado, or how do we deal with the pack that has migrated here on their own. What I did with that bill, just so you guys can look at it if you want, is even though we did not pass it in committee, we did introduce a bill that reflected, and it got adopted so it's publicly available, a bill that reflected all of the stakeholder input. And what's important about that is the voices that are reflected in the bill draft that is out there is the agricultural community as well as the wolf advocates. Both of their voices are very strongly represented in that draft bill. So I hope it'll provide a pathway if the ballot initiative passes this fall, which I assume many of you know that there will be a ballot question asking about the reintroduction of wolves, that the work we did on that bill will provide a framework of perhaps how to implement that if it does gain enough votes to pass in the fall. What are some other big things we got done? I would really point to secure savings as a bill that we passed that I have in the years to come. Secure savings is essentially a state-sponsored savings plan. And it'll be a public-private partnership with the state. And who manages the funds, because many of us know, particularly in our mountain resort and rural communities, that many of us don't have access to a traditional 401k type savings plan because many of us don't work for large employers, right? We have 3 jobs spread out over the year, or we run our own business, or we work in a business where it's just 3 folks working their tail off. And that it doesn't always come with a savings plan. And what we're seeing is that young folks, but even people into their 50s and 40s, which is still young, all right, still young, have very little savings. There was one study that showed that in Colorado, people have an average of $600 in savings. $600 isn't enough to weather any emergency. And so we really need to set people up for success, because the problem that we are trying to avoid decades down the road is basically the aging millennial generation reaching retirement age and not having any savings. And then we would have a crisis of the state having to create safety nets for an aging population that doesn't have any of their own resources. So we are starting today to try to avoid a problem decades in the future. But I'm really proud of that bill. It took multiple years to get passed. So it's really good to get that one across the finish line. We also did really important work around water rights, the in-stream flow program. This was another multi-year effort, and it will become, I think, increasingly important, particularly on the western slope, where we are seeing the drought creep up the Colorado River Basin. If you guys are watching the drought maps, your stomach should flip a little bit. We are seeing a very significant drought pattern coming our way this summer. I will say at my ranch, I normally run 3 big irrigation guns. Through June, I am down to 1. I normally don't hit 1 irrigation gun till mid-August. So we're seeing on a micro level on just my little ranch, what we're seeing across the broad Colorado River Basin. So an in-stream flow program allows us to manage water rights with a little bit more flexibility in order to keep water in the river, to keep our riparian habitat really healthy and preserve those really low water levels where we get decreased oxygen, we get increased temperature, and you start seeing significant impacts to all the wildlife that depends on those rivers. So another great bill to get across the finish line this year and have that as a tool for us to use going forward. So those are just two of the bills that I'm really glad we got done this year.
Awesome. Thank you, Senator. I want to highlight a couple of others, and then we will get to our questions. I am so proud of how the Western Slope has led the charge on healthcare reform in this state. Last year, Senator Donovan and I worked on reinsurance. As many of you know, we were able to pass that and see a 30% reduction on the individual marketplace in health insurance premiums. This year, we took reinsurance back into play, and we were able to refinance it for the next 5 years by capturing a fee that is currently placed on health insurance carriers. That fee goes away at the federal level, and instead of letting it disappear entirely, the state will now capture that exact same amount from health insurance carriers and use it to fund reinsurance and to expand access for those families who are caught in something called the family glitch, where one member of the family may have access to health insurance through their employer, but they don't have affordable access for their entire family. And so our dollars will help provide affordable insurance for that family. And I think very most important, and something that was critical to me, and I know Senator Donovan, is that we now can provide coverage for those individuals in our communities who are undocumented, including our DACA dreamers. And I am thrilled to see that that is now an option for individuals in our state, ever so important. I also want to mention that we were able to protect our $1 million in wildfire mitigation grant funding, and Representative Carver, a Republican from the Colorado Springs area, and I carried a bill to expand the grant program so that lower wealth communities can now also participate. That's particularly important for rural Colorado, so we're excited to get that done. I also carried a bill with Representative Caraveo to put a nicotine tax measure on the ballot this fall in November. This statewide tobacco and nicotine tax question would increase taxes on current tobacco products and, for the first time ever, tax vaping products, which we know vaping has become an epidemic for our youth, particularly here on the Western Slope. We know that tax increases impact that use, so we're hoping to see an improvement there. And I am proud to say that for the first 3 years, funding from this tax measure will go to protect our K-12 schools during this difficult time. We've earmarked a particular amount, $25 million for the first year, 30 and then 35 for rural schools. So all of the school districts up here in our mountain communities and on the Eastern Plains will see additional funding because of the challenges we face in rural Colorado with smaller school districts. So pleased that we were able to do that. And then in year 4 of the funding measure, we will be able to offer for the first time ever a statewide preschool help for our 4-year-olds. So every 4-year-old in the state will receive up to 10 hours and more if they're from a low-income family, but 10 hours of free preschool, which we're also pretty excited about. So those are some of my highlights. Let's see if we can't get to some of the questions, Senator Donovan. We have a couple on here about Gallagher. There is a measure that passed out of the General Assembly. Senator Donovan and I were not carriers of the Gallagher measure, but we both voted in favor of this. Senator Donovan, do you want to talk first about what's coming in the fall and then what we anticipate for our mountain communities?
Sure. You know, I think Gallagher could be a town hall all on its own, and its interaction with our Constitution and Tabor. If anyone wants a little bit more information on this, please feel free to reach out to us, because it is a complicated, interwoven set of policies that I think maybe most simply concluded, I think are having unintended consequences years and decades after they originally passed. The name that the gentleman who Gallagher is named after has even publicly said this is not what he intended. Gallagher has not played out how he thought it would. And what Gallagher has done over time is it's had, I think, the perverse effect of changing the state and local relationship of how things are funded. And over time, it has shifted the paradigm to the exact mirror of what it was, so the reverse. And it also has had, I think, in rural communities, an outsized impact on our small businesses that line our main streets. So the initiative this fall will ask the citizens of Colorado to really examine Gallagher and ask if it's still the right fit for the state of Colorado. I voted in support of putting the initiative on the ballot. It gained broad bipartisan support to put this to the vote of the people. And I don't often weigh in on ballot initiatives because I think it's really important that that citizens take the time and determine how they would vote. But I do think that it is really time for our state to examine the Gallagher TABOR interaction and the impact that it has on a state, particularly through the lens of COVID-19. One thing that we really struggled with was because of the restrictions on the financial resources that the state is able to collect and preserve. We really don't have a rainy day fund. And I was looking at how other states were responding to COVID-19, and it was remarkable what states were able to do at a rainy day fund, because they very quickly with grants and cash resources and stand up new programs. And Colorado just didn't have that type of resource to use because of the impact of things like Gallagher and Tabor. So you guys have months to research it. And then I always remind folks, particularly on complicated issues where perhaps if you aren't a political professor, really use that blue book that will come out in late summer that will have both sides of the issues presented in plain language. And you can get that blue book, either it should come to you in the mail, or you can often go to one of your municipal offices or your county clerk and pick one up as well. Oh, and let me say one more thing, Rep. McCluskie, too. Particularly for rural areas and mountain communities, Gallagher has seen, and Rep. McCluskie, you can probably illuminate on this more because of your history so intimately in the education system, of in rural communities, it really does have an outsized impact on how we fund and support our school districts.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. The forecast right now, just based on what we've seen with the pandemic and the impact that that it will have on commercial rates, is that we will see an 18% drop in residential property taxes in this next year, the next valuation that's completed. That moves us from 7.15% to 5.88%. And that's still just a projection, but that could mean as much as $491 million in cuts to our schools and $200 million or more in cuts to county governments. And that's because we rely so heavily on residential property taxes in this state. And when they go down, our local governments, our special districts, our schools are adversely impacted. I am certainly in favor of repealing Gallagher. The work around this started 2 or 3 years ago, before I was elected, with a group of bipartisan lawmakers who realized that even if you appreciate our low residential tax rates, the impacts are significant. And when we have responsibilities both to operate local government as well as state government, and we have that ratcheting effect that comes into play between Gallagher and Tabor, we're not doing what we need to be able to do in this state properly when the funding is so restricted and so tangled up in knots. So I think the interim committee that had been working had also suggested a repeal of Gallagher, but had done so with a couple of replacement models in mind. Because of our time constraints for this session, I think there was that bipartisan support. We need to get a repeal of Gallagher on the ballot. We need for our public to weigh in on this. Should that happen, I think the challenge for the next session will be to start work on that replacement model. There was a companion bill that passed alongside the Gallagher ballot measure that would freeze rates so that we can take that time and really, with stakeholder input, using the smartest of the smart, be able to sit down at a table and look at what should be the tax structure for Coloradans. So very pleased with that. Thank you, Senator. I want to go to another question that we've got here. And these are, again, questions that came in from our participants prior to today's Zoom meeting. Do you know of any initiatives that seek funding or in-kind grants to provide internet service and computers to families who have none? If you don't know of any such initiatives, could one be started perhaps? This comes to one of our participants from here in Summit. I can start on this one, Senator, and then kick it over to you. Senator Donovan has long been a champion for expanding rural broadband access here on the Western Slope and throughout Colorado. She's done tremendous work over the years, which I know I'm personally grateful for, but I believe many of our small rural mountain communities and those communities out on the plains are grateful for as well. We do have an initiative here in Summit County for Summit schools. We call it One to World. For the past 6 or 7 years, our students have all had a computer or an iPad provided by the school district. And in addition to that, have had access to broadband through a program that Comcast provides called Internet Essentials. It's a program that allows lower income families to access Wi-Fi in their homes at a reduced rate. And I believe, given the pandemic, Summit School District was well situated to be able to handle remote learning, distance learning, given that we could not hold classes in classrooms in our facilities. But I do know that that continues to be a challenge, access to the internet and having access to laptops and iPads in other mountain communities. Gunnison, for example, has been meeting with both fiber providers as well as satellite providers to try and figure out how they can expand broadband access in their community. Senator, anything to add?
Um, I don't know of any state initiative that would specifically address that issue, but I do know that many of the providers, so your CenturyLink, your Comcast, a lot of those companies do have programs to provide discounted or free internet service, and can often also work with providing devices. So if you want to, we'll put our emails up at the end of this town hall, and are happy to try to connect you if you're having any issues getting through the, telephone push 1, push 2, push 3 maze, and try to help you find those assets. I also, to be honest with you, I don't think it's a program that the state would probably stand up in the near future. I think that'll be more of a local community and or provider type program.
Great, thank you, Senator. I want to go to one of the questions that came in from one of our listeners now. And this has to do with climate change. Let me see if I get this right. Is there a possibility that we could legislate natural assets as a state infrastructure asset, such as in California? And this may be in relationship to electric vehicles and possibly the tax credits. I'm a little bit confused. Thank you, Tom, for the question, but I'm not sure that I've captured this exactly right. Last year, we did put specific carbon emission goals into statute, which was significant for our state. I think one of the few states, if not only, that has taken that measure. And there were a lot of numerous legislation that was considered last year, providing tax credits on electric vehicles. Senator Donovan, anything particular to add on those two fronts, or the infrastructure assets referred to in the question?
Yeah, I know the governor's office, energy office, is really focused on building out the EV infrastructure. Rep. McCluskie, correct me if I'm wrong in this, but I believe we were using some settlement money from years ago to continue to work towards that goal, as a way to achieve our carbon emission reduction goals. I think it still will be a challenge in the more rural parts of the state, to really have the EV charging infrastructure that we need to have people know that an EV vehicle is easily driven, on our scenic routes throughout the state. But that work is being done. Probably won't be fast enough to the satisfaction of many, but it is a priority of the governor's energy office. In terms of the second part of that question on citing our natural landscapes as with a type of protection that you've seen, I would love if you could forward us information on that. I'm not familiar with that concept, but would love to look into it if that's something you can share with us, or I will try to track it down myself. An interesting concept. I think we're always in Colorado. We really have a nonpartisan shared value of our public lands, and ways to make sure that those public lands are protected well into the future and are kept public. I think we're starting to see pressures, we are continuing to see pressures from the current administration that I don't think align with the majority, by far and large, the majority of how Colorado views their public lands, not as an asset to be sold off to the highest bidder who has the deepest pockets today, but more lands that should be preserved for generations to come as natural assets. So, I think any work we can continue to do around that would be interesting. But we're always looking for ways to make sure that everything from, and what the state can do around federal land too, right, is also a challenge. because I think my district, you know, we can have 3/4 of the land be public lands, and by and large, a lot of that's federal. But continuing to always be in contact with our congressional delegations and making sure that they're hearing from the voices on the ground about how, you know, how they envision the future of those lands. And I'll tell you what, I never hear from people that are like, can you please open more land for drilling? That is never a constituent email that I have gotten.
Great comment. I have not gotten that one either. Here's a question that came in earlier. Mental health reform, are there any updates? I would love to point out that we had 2 different bills pass as part of that COVID-19 relief package that included funding for mental health. We had $15 million dedicated to ensuring that our community health, mental health centers are funded during this time to be able to continue their outreach. We also passed a bill for telehealth. There was an emergency executive order put in place to allow telehealth services to be funded via Medicaid. That has just been extended, and then there was roughly $5 million put aside for ongoing telehealth support. A way that families can still reach their doctor, engage with their doctor on a variety of health needs from the safety of their home without having to go out to a doctor's office or to a hospital. Anything to add on the mental health front, Senator Donovan?
I was really glad to see there was a lot of us that had different bills on telehealth, and we kind of all combined them into this omnibus bill at the end of the year that addressed a great many issues with telehealth, because that's so critical in our parts of the community where access can be difficult, finding that one appointment when the specialist travels up from Denver. Like, we all know how this works. So telehealth is great. You know, I think maybe not directly addressing mental health, but certainly related, is we were able to pass a package of bills addressing opioid addiction and other substance abuse problems in our communities. That package of bills had to be re-examined once we knew the financial realities that we were facing, but they're still really meaningful. And I'm really proud of being able to work on some of those, because they together create a really comprehensive, with lots of different touch points addressing the issues in lots of different ways, because we've actually, another sad result of this pandemic is with increased isolation, fewer resources, not having your support system, we're seeing substance abuse disorders increase with the requirements of staying at home and more isolating behaviors. So we know the opioid epidemic was something that we saw in our communities. It hit rural Colorado pretty hard. But so it was great to be able to pass that package of bills to really address the opioid epidemic as it was and how we saw it increase during the pandemic. You know, I might just jump into another question we saw come through the Q&A on specifically addressing Black Hills, but kind of the overall utility picture in Colorado. We really are at an interesting time right now where a lot of communities are coming together and examining if their current utility provider is the right fit for their values, or what a municipality will want. And we have done some work around ensuring that, if a municipality wants to move forward, we've tried to put some both in legislation and just by reaching out to utilities, working with our congressional colleagues or writing letters of support. We've done, Rep. McCluskie and I have done quite a bit of work in this arena, but I think Emily Tracy, I think it was Emily's question that is highlighting a new problem that I think we need to address. So thank you for that, Emily. I will look into that. Of course, as you know, that won't be until January when we return to session, that we could start drafting legislation. But I certainly see what you're getting at, is making sure that while a community might be looking at, a different utility provider, that we need to make sure that we don't have a gap in that fee collection so that no one's left in a lurch. So thanks for that flag.
Great. Thank you, Senator. And another great question. I do want to speak briefly. We've had a couple of comments come in about Senate Bill 217, which is the Police Accountability and Integrity, Law Enforcement, Police and Police Accountability and Integrity Bill. And as many of you, I'm sure all of you are aware, not only was the legislature dealing with the pandemic, during our time down at the Capitol, we also were in the midst of the response to George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matters protests and conversations that were happening at the Capitol. And I am incredibly proud of the number of people that came together that looked at efforts around legislation over the past years, not just this session. This was a particular bill that really was based on the work of years, if not decades, in trying to work in the space around law enforcement reform that supports the hardworking, good police officers that we know in our small mountain communities and down along the Front Range are doing what is right and what is just, but dealing more effectively with the challenges of systemic racism that we see in law enforcement. And the bill that was passed received tremendous bipartisan support. I really want to give a shout out to the county commissioners, our county sheriff, Jamie Fitzsimons, county attorney, and other groups from across the mountain areas that reached out to me to share their thoughts and input and voices in crafting that legislation. I think it was bold and certainly pleased to see the level of conversation and negotiation that went on to deliver a bill that I think represents the voices of our law enforcement leaders, as well as the voices of those who have felt impacted by systemic racism and some of the challenges built into how we conduct business. The question that came in relates to this bill, but talks about, couldn't we defund police departments as well as prison budgets to better take care of education and healthcare needs? The state does not fund local law enforcement. That's a county responsibility. That's a town and city responsibility. The state does have the Colorado State Patrol, and they are a part of this new legislation to a degree. I believe there are ongoing discussions about how CSP may be included with future legislation. But the defunding question really isn't one for the state. I think on the corrections front, one of the challenges we have seen in corrections over the past couple of years has been that mix of inmate, of clients, and how our facilities are best handling the volume of people that are coming in. There is a prison study that is going to be completed thanks to legislation that ran this year to better understand how our system is working, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, and what we need to do to improve that. Anything that you would add, Senator Donovan?
Yeah, I think it's really, I'm glad this question came up, because I think it's a really important time that we give space to having these conversations and, give them the thoughtfulness and look at the full spectrum. I'm really, really proud we passed 217. In the Senate, it was a remarkable process to be a part of, and something that I think I'll remember. It'll be definitely one of those bills that I remember for, I think, the rest of my life, to watch both sides of the aisle come together. People who were coming at it from different perspectives, including, I will certainly want to lift up Senator John Cook, a former sheriff of Weld County, who really came to the table and made the bill better and ultimately supported it, as well as the majority of the Republicans in the Senate voted for this bill at the end of the day. So we are the first state in the nation to pass a comprehensive kind of police accountability bill. And I think it will be something that is looked to and duplicated by other states to come because of the strong voice from the advocates that are in that bill for really asking for significant changes, while also finding the right timeline to implement it, finding the right way to support our peace officers so that at the end of this day, this bill supports our peace officers while really addressing some of these ongoing problems that we are seeing across the country in terms of our policing culture. So really proud of 217. When it comes to our corrections across the state, these are ongoing difficult conversations to have. I know that there is not a lot of support for continuing private prisons. That is something that Colorado is really moving away from, that people shouldn't be profiting from a prison industry. But while we say that, we also need to acknowledge that there are a lot of really good people that work in the corrections, work in our corrections and in our prison systems. And right now we are seeing a lot of staff turnover, a lot of people come in and out of them as guards. And so we need to figure out how we support the folks that keep our prisons safe and are really doing that hard work, while making sure that we are continuing to make sure that we are not, it would be great if we had no need for prisons, but until that day comes, I think we need to fund our prisons to a level that supports the people that work in them.
Well said. Thank you. I want to hit we have just a few minutes left. I want to hit one last question that has come up around the nicotine tax ballot measure. I know in Summit County, there was a local measure passed on collecting nicotine taxes here. Kudos to Summit County for leading the way. As I have understood it, the state measure would be on top of what has been done locally. It would not replace those local measures that are passed across the state. For any additional specifics on the state measure, please send me an email, follow up with me, and I'll be sure that we talk specifically about the new state measure and what will be coming in November. I also want to hit on some questions about education funding. As I mentioned earlier when I was speaking about the budget, we did have some significant cuts in both K-12 and higher education this year that we are hoping are one-time cuts, and that we're able to restore that funding with a rebounding economy next year and or additional federal funds. However, I also want to comment that there will be a statewide ballot measure, Fair Tax 271, that would change income taxes for individuals in the state and increase the amount of money that goes to schools. For additional information on Fair Tax 271 as well, reach out to me. Again, another ballot measure for our public to weigh in on, for our public to decide if that's the right course of action for Colorado. And given how TABOR works, this is how we are going to solve the funding challenges our state faces. That is by going to the voters and asking for support on individual measures. I think at last count, Senator Donovan, there are like 10 ballot measures at the state level that voters will be asked to answer. Many that we've talked about here today, wolves, funding for public schools, the nicotine tax, and that doesn't account for other local measures that you may be asked to talk about, or to vote on. So the Blue Book, very important this year. Always reach out to myself or Senator Donovan if you have questions. With that, any final words, Senator Donovan, before we wrap up?
Yeah, just want to express gratitude and thankfulness for all of you that joined us this morning. And really, I've been so inspired over the past months by the people of Senate District 5, and I would say the broader Mountain and Western Slope communities. COVID-19 really brought tragedy to many of our neighborhoods. I know I lost friends. I'm sure many of you have too, or possibly even tragically lost a family member as well. So this has been really, really hard times. But time and time again, particularly because we were the first in the state to have COVID-19 cases, our county health officials, our business leaders, our Chamber of Commerce, our teachers, our principals, our elected local officials, county commissioners, town council folks, trustees, were the first ones to identify a problem, but also were the first ones to bring a solution. And so know that so many of your emails and your phone calls directly resulted in how a governor's executive order was written, how we drafted the COVID-19 recovery bills. We really couldn't have done our jobs without your commitment to be a voice for your community. So thank you. Thank you so much. And I hope you will continue to reach out and send emails and texts in the coming months. While the session is over, which means that many of us return to our quote unquote real jobs, and we're out of the Capitol and we don't have staff to help us answer phones or respond to emails, know that you have two very willing public servants to support you and Julie and I. So we just threw up our emails and phone numbers. Please continue to use those. And make sure that if you're seeing something that needs fixed, if you need help on a specific issue, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And if you have that idea for that next great bill that we should start working on for next January, don't hesitate to reach out on that. It is a pleasure to serve you guys, and I look forward to the months ahead as we continue to work together.
Senator Donovan, very well said. Thank you for all your words. I would echo how much I appreciate the people that reach out to me in my district, that engage on the issues they care most about. I want to remind everybody to vote. Primary ends tomorrow, and it's too late to mail your ballot. If you haven't yet turned it in, please do so today. Drop boxes are around our communities, and certainly it's important to be a part of the democratic process. Thank you all for joining us for this virtual coffee and conversation. We hope to have another one here before session again. And enjoy your day. It looks like the sun is out. It's time to get outside and have some fun. Thanks, everyone.